We're going to talk about event-driven programming in PHP. Specifically, we'll talk a little about Websockets, and we'll get into a couple other things, but that's kind of the focus of the talk. So about me, yada yada, blah blah. I've done everything for many years. So, all right. So what's event-driven programming? Is everyone familiar with event-driven programming? Basically, an event happens and you have something that handles that event. So why do you care about event-driven programming? In traditional programming, you're dealing with going step by step. You do step 1 and then you do step 2, then you do step 3. This is very easy to understand, but it can be slower and it can have a lot more overhead. For example, how many run like Ubuntu or something on your desktops? So they used to, back in the days, everyone used the sysinit, and it would do everything in order. So it'd start up this system, then it would start up that system, then it would start up the next system one by one. And then someone realized, this is really slow because most of the time we're just waiting for stuff to happen. It's, we could be doing other things during that time. So first they went to upstart and now systemd. But the idea behind that is you do whatever, as soon as the dependencies have been met, then it'll start up that service. It'll get it started, and so it'll be able to get through them a lot faster because you can have 5 things waiting at the same time instead of one thing waiting at a time. And so you'll get through the whole process faster. So that's what event-driven programming, you're waiting for the events, and then you run the registered callback. Who uses Apache for their web server? Anybody? So we got this side of the room is Apache. You guys are all Nginx. So Lighty, something, So Apache's traditional model was that you have workers that they accept a request, they handle the requests, they send their thing back. Nginx came out and kind of threw that on its head by it started out as a completely single-threaded web server. So there was just one process, and it would accept the events and figure out what it needed to do. But most of the time, when it's handling a web request, is spent waiting for the disk drive or waiting. It's waiting for something or waiting for some network traffic, those kinds of things. So while it's waiting, it says, okay, I'll go handle some other stuff. And so it just says, when this is done, when this file comes back from the file system or when this request is finished coming in, let me know and I'll handle it. So instead of having a single process per connection, you have one process that's able to handle thousands of connections at a time because it's doing this event-driven model. And so it just waits for events to happen and then deals with those events as they happen. So that's called the event loop. So how does this event loop work? There's a lot of waiting. It's all about the waiting. So as things are waiting, you can do other things. If you've got 1,000 requests that you're dealing with, each one is waiting on different things at different times. You can just deal with the things that you need to one at a time and wait on while everything else is waiting. So React PHP is a event-driven library for PHP. I believe the name there's a React.js that it's based very loosely on. But there's other event-driven models. I believe the Python Twisted was one of the first more popular ones. So React PHP was the first one to really bring this to PHP, where you could do an event loop in PHP. So there are some things. Now, the things that you're using have to work with the event loop, which basically means the event loop works by waiting for, it's going to be waiting for your file descriptors, for things to come in on file descriptors, for that to be ready. So as long as you can give it a file descriptor for it to wait on, then you can write the library to work with React PHP. So Redis works with it. Dnode PHP is Node.js, RPC bindings, WebSockets, ZeroMQ, Stomp. I've never heard of Stomp before, but someone wrote a library for it. And then React Promise. We'll talk a little about promises. And that's not actually an asynchronous thing or event-driven. It doesn't deal with file descriptors directly, but you can use it within your other libraries. And we'll talk about that. So you notice Redis. I know since we got Sasha here, I'll point out that MySQL doesn't work the way that, there's no way to do that. Although MySQL does have asynchronous query where you can do stuff while you're waiting for the query results. It's not compatible with React PHP because it doesn't expose a file descriptor for you to wait on. So as long as you have a file descriptor, though, you can do that. So promise. Does anyone use promises in JavaScript or any other language? So promises, there's actually, I'll talk a little bit about them. They kind of deserve their own presentation, which is why you should go to the one immediately following this one in room 134 where someone's talking about promises. So I don't have to tell everything about promises, which is nice. So promises, so with you think everybody, I mean, all PHP programmers have dealt with JavaScript code, right? And who's done the nested callbacks where you end up like 10 levels deep in callbacks, and I mean, how it gets a little bit confusing, right? Trying to figure out where you are and keep track of everything. So that's kind of, you got the Matryoshka doll thing. That's what you're dealing with callbacks. What promises try to do is flatten that out so that you can see, okay, this, then this, then this, then this. And that's actually how it works. So it uses, the React PHP one uses the common JS promises /a API. So I'm not seeing has a note there, but and by the way, sorry, I've had a really bad cold like a week ago, and it's still getting some coughs and stuff. So if I cough, I've got a cough drop, I've got my water, I've tried to do my best. But so before promises, you have this thing where you basically you got callbacks, and it gets nested further and further. Pretty soon you're at the end of your editor, and lines are very short. So if you use promises, you'll see, I said when after this is done, then you do that. Then is the kind of one of the main keywords in promises. So this function will return a promise, and you just pass it then, or you call then method with the callback. And so you see how you can have them more serial. You're still using callbacks, but you're doing it more serially instead of nesting them, if that makes sense. So you say when this is done, then do this callback, instead of passing the callback directly in. That's kind of the idea behind it. And then there's some other stuff like the when, where you can just pass in multiple things, and as long as they handle that correctly, you can just do them. So that's actually the when method. These are just things that are being called in or passed into the when method. So again, go to room 134 if you want to learn about promises. That starts at 3 o'clock. So in PHP, promises use that kind of model. So this is a whois client. So we're doing a bunch of whois requests. I had to do this once for a company who wanted to find, because all the numeric domains were taken. I won't tell you which company this was. They were trying to be sneaky. They wanted a domain that could look like an IP address, but really be a domain, so that when people saw it, they wouldn't think anything of it when it was like loading whatever. They ended up with one with an O instead of a 0. And I had to look through trying to find what domains were available. Anyway, so I've done this before, done a whole bunch of whois requests. But basically, for each one, we're doing the check, and we say when it's done, then we're going to call this callback. Now you see we're doing this for each. So this check will actually return immediately. So when I do the for each, it just goes through it very fast, and then in the background, as soon as the check actually really does finish, it'll call then, and it'll display. So I might get them out of order, depending on when they're returned. Now the key with PHP is that you have to call, with React PHP, is you have to run this loop. So I left out a little bit of code involved with that loop, because as you can see, I never actually set up the loop, which you have to call as something to set up the loop. But basically at the end, you run your loop, and it'll actually, it already knows. So it's done when it calls this check method. It actually, that check method did the initial request for the whois, and then registered this file descriptor on a socket saying, when something comes back, let me know.
Question, what's this wisdom class?
The wisdom class is a whois client.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's available on the React PHP website. It's not. Most people don't do a lot of whois, so it's really not that useful for most people. But if you do a lot of whois, then you can check that out. Yes?
So is that's perfect timing. So is the promise in wisdom, or is it in domain? I don't quite get.
OK, so the domain is just a string.
Oh.
So that's like I'm checking google.com, right? So that's what the domain is. What's returned by this check is an object, a promise object. And I'll call then on the promise object, and then pass it a callback.
You might need
So so this callback isn't immediately run, though. The promise will actually wait for, it'll wait for this check to really be fulfilled. So it immediately returns an object, a promise object, but the promise has different states. And so when that promise is fulfilled, then it'll call then, or this function that we passed to then. Does that make sense? So you call, you're actually, when you're in this loop here, you're calling then, because the promise was returned. You're just telling it, you're basically registering a callback function for whenever this finishes. Does that make sense?
Function part of React then?
Yes. Yeah, the promise.
Do like an HTTP request, or what's going on there?
For what, the whois?
The domain, yeah. Check the
Yeah, so the whois is on, it's a special protocol.
It's special.
Yeah, it's on port 42, I think.
Okay.
It's an obsolete old protocol that is mostly used by spammers who want to harvest email addresses these days. But although I think they've pretty much blocked, they have all sorts of, if you try to do too many at once, you'll get blocked by throttle, they'll throttle you and stuff. So that kind of makes this code useless because you'll get throttled by whoever you're trying to do all those requests to. So
Unless you forge your source IP.
yeah, but then you won't get the result.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have multiple routes going out,
No.
you might have Tors, and you can set up a proxy there.
We'll cover that in the next class.
Yeah. So Sasha will be doing a presentation at 5 o'clock on how to.
That syntax used $domain. A couple months ago, this is a relatively new PHP feature, and it confused me when I was looking at a code like that. Maybe it's worth mentioning that it just means to make that $domain variable available inside the closure function.
Oh, right. Yeah. Sorry. Use. Yeah, I didn't mention that. Yeah, use is since PHP 5.3 or 4. It's relatively recent in the last few years, but it just says it's a scoping operator. So it says this variable I want to have available within my function. So you want to take so in JavaScript, when you always have access to the variables from the outer scope when you define a callback function. In PHP, you do not. Each function has its own scope, and so you're saying you have to declare which variables you want access to from the outer scope. If you put an ampersand in there, then it lets you change it as well. But that wouldn't be useful for this. All right, so that's enough about promises. Let's talk about some really fun stuff with event callbacks. So just so you know, the promises kind of, a lot of the libraries built in React PHP use promises internally. And so you can, like that wisdom class, uses promises in order to make things easier for you. So there is a lot of that promise stuff built in. So it's helpful to understand how that works. So let's talk about how we're going to do our own event-driven programming in PHP. So you've got your emitter. It emits events, right? You know what this is? You put tennis balls in the top. It spits them out there. And hopefully, you have something to handle those events, right? If an event comes and nothing's there to handle it, what happens? It hits a fence, right? So the way the event loop works is you just register methods or functions as callbacks for certain events. So you're basically hooking into different events and saying, when this event happens, I want to handle that event, right? As an example, there's an HTTP server in React PHP. It's a very simple HTTP server, not one you would probably want to use in production. But it gets, when a request comes in, it spits out an event, a request event. So if you have an onRequest method registered, then it will call that with the information from the event. If you get you can also have on open, on close, on error, things like that are common in these kind of events. So one thing to be aware of when you're dealing with event loops is that if your code is running, it's not running the event loop. So if you have an event come in and then you run a huge block of code that takes 5 seconds to run, you can't handle any other events during that time. So when you're doing this type of event-driven programming, you want to handle things quickly and pass things back pass control back to the event loop. You don't want things that are going to take a long time and hold up your event loop, or else everything else will get blocked. Okay, so here's some example code. We'll go through real quick. So this is our very simple HTTP server. So I told you before that I left off a couple bits of that. So here is just a factory to create the loop. So you just have to create your loop at the start so you can call it. In this case, we need a socket. So we're going to create a socket. We're going to pass it the loop so that it will know, it'll register itself with the loop. And then the HTTP server has access to that socket. And then we'll go ahead and tell it, on request, we're going to do this function, right? So we're registering a handler for the request event. So when a request happens, we want this to happen. And we're going to deal with it. All we're going to do here is write a header, content type text plain, and we're going to send hello world, and we're done. We tell the socket to listen on 8080, and we run the loop. That's our simple HTTP server. So this isn't how you normally code in PHP, right? So do you have any questions before I move on to?
Just a comment.
Yeah.
I'll just say why I like this better than Node.js. In Node.js, when I go to do some basic I/O, that I do not care to be async. I have to deal with the fact that default is async, and then I have to do promises and whatnot.
Right.
In PHP, if I know that I don't care to make something async, inside that handler, I can just go ahead and do it the normal PHP way.
Right. Yeah, and so like I said, if this function took a long time, if I was doing a bunch of code in there and doing some database calls and doing running reports, then yeah, you'd have a problem where you'd be blocking. But in this case, it's very simple. I know I can just do it, and we're done. We pass control back to the callback or to the event loop. Any other questions or comments?
I have
Yeah,
a
Mark.
question, just since you brought up Node at the beginning here. Is Node better at handling blocking? This seems like you've got to really take note and be careful of causing an issue with blocking here.
Node, you basically have the same issue. It's just that more in Node you have more libraries that support. It's more asynchronous native, like Sasha said. So,
So being able to
so your database queries are going to be able to, you make your database query and say, hey, when this gets back, let me know.
And it forces you to be asynchronous.
Right.
which in an event-driven thing would seem advantageous
Yeah.
typically.
Yeah.
But the challenge, though, is when you're forced to be synchronous, then the probability you introduce bugs where you normally
Yeah.
would not be introducing bugs, where you could just do some simple things synchronously and be done.
Yeah, asynchronous programming is often not when you're doing a ton, it can get confusing, which is why they made promises. It kind of helps keep it more manageable.
Keep the genie in the bottle.
But yeah, it can be a lot harder to debug and figure, because your state could be anything at any point, because things can happen out of order. They can happen, you have no control over what order things are happening. So there's with asynchronous, and so yeah, it's definitely, so that's kind of so with Node, yeah, your database calls are probably going to be asynchronous, which can be a good thing, because you can pass control back to the event loop, let it do more stuff while you're waiting for your database queries. So with this, there aren't, I think if React PHP catches on more, there will be more libraries made to work with it so that you can do more stuff asynchronously, which would kind of, but yeah, if you're doing more complicated stuff, Node would probably be better. But on the other hand, if it's not terribly complicated and you already know PHP and all of your code is in PHP, it's why start up a Node server just for one simple little thing? That's where I got into this. I run a website that has a chat room. I run a message board. So it has a chat room as well. And the chat room I wrote back in 2000, I want to say like 1 originally. And I made some minor changes over the years, but it was basically, doing, it's just making, it got to where originally it was making requests every second. And then it got to making AJAX requests instead of doing it in a frame, which was how it originally did it. But it was basically the same thing. It was polling. And so my message board is for a sports team. And so during the games, there'd be hundreds of people in the chat room. And the whole server would just bog down with all these poll requests. So I rewrote it using React PHP because I didn't want a Node server because everything on my site is PHP. I didn't want to implement something new just for the chat room. And so I tried out React PHP. It was dead easy to write. I can now handle, I don't think I've had more than a couple hundred people in my chat room at once, but it handles it very easily. There's no, it's single threaded, so there's not tons of resource usage. It just really runs well. So that's kind of where I see React PHP being useful, is that kind of space. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Oh, go ahead.
Where in the process is this ran? Is this just ran once in your application?
So what happens to right here, you're just registering this callback function, right? So you're saying,
This server,
so when you run the loop here, that's when you enter the event loop and it never exits. Unless there's a way to specifically exit the event loop, but
Are you asking
by
if it's
default.
run from like command line or something?
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Node you'd fire up.
Yeah,
This, do you just create
Yeah, I have
just
a-
in one page and then just hit that
No,
page?
no, I run it from the command line. I use, I can't remember.
CLI?
What'd you say? Supervisor, yes, Supervisor D. That's what it is. I use Supervisor D to make sure that and I can also, like on mine, it's a lot more complicated. It actually, every like 15 seconds or something, 15 or 30 seconds, it goes through, I registered a timer that will go through all the files that are included by my code and check if any of them have changed. And if they have, it'll exit so that Supervisor D will restart it. So that when I push up changes, they automatically get incorporated. I don't have to go restart the server. Anyway, but you can do all sorts of things with that.
So Supervisor D in the web server that you're running? could you say-
Now, Supervisor D is what Supervisor D does is keep so what I'm doing is running PHP code from the command line. And Supervisor D just makes sure it stays running. So if it exits, it starts it back up again.
You tell it how many workers you want to run? Okay, you were just saying that this wasn't a very good implementation for production.
Oh, this is as a web server. I wouldn't use,
Oh, you just run
I wouldn't run this as my web server. Yeah,
You just have your web server call this.
yeah. Well, I wouldn't run, yeah.
So what would you use in production?
Well, we'll talk about the next.
Okay, sorry.
The next slide, we'll talk about WebSockets. Web server, not really a great use case.
One more comment.
WebSockets are a lot more useful.
A good use case for React PHP would be, let's say you have a PHP page or PHP service of some kind, and sending my HTTP request to something that runs, let's say on Apache, runs in PHP, and that thing needs to query multiple TCP sockets of some kind, either issue multiple HTTP requests that could take a long time.
Right.
Or whatever, send emails out, whatever, do something like that. But most of the code is synchronous. There is just 5% that needs to be async. That's where React PHP will be just perfect.
Yeah. Yep. So, WebSockets, what are they? WebSockets are persistent connections. So they're like a instead of HTTP requests, you make a request, you get a response, you're done. Now the connection may stay open, but you don't have, as a web programmer, you don't have access to that connection. You can't send stuff back. Once, as far as you're concerned, as soon as you send your response, you're done. The connection's closed, right? So, I mean, we're going to ignore keep alives and stuff like that because those don't really affect you because they're still, the browser has to initiate those. Does that make sense? So they don't really help you because you can't send, if you want to push information back to the client, keep alives don't help you. So a WebSocket, on the other hand, is a persistent connection, so you can do two-way communication. You can send stuff back at any time. They can send stuff to you. You just handle it as it comes in. So where does it work? On IE, you've got to be on version 10 or higher. It's not going to work below 10. Fortunately, that's getting a lot more than it used to be. KitKat, you got to have at least KitKat in Android for it to work. iOS 6 is where they added it in iOS. Chrome and Firefox have had it forever, so you're pretty good with, and they update automatically anyway, so you're pretty good with Chrome and Firefox. Yes?
Is the WebSockets part of HTML5?
It's
Sort of separate?
it's part of something, yeah. I mean, the whole HTML5, the JavaScript, yeah. It's part of that whole thing. Yeah, but everybody supports it now. Although, if you have the most recent browser of anything, it'll support WebSockets, of the major browsers anyway. So, probably IE is your worst problem, although there's still a lot of 4.3 Android out, Jelly Bean. But, yeah, IE 10 is going to be that minimum is going to be a problem for a little while longer. So the web server also has to support WebSockets. What happens, I'll show you in a second, but basically you make a web connection and then you upgrade it to WebSockets. So you start with a normal HTTP connection and then you say, hey, I want to upgrade to a WebSockets connection. Cookies. Who likes cookies? The great thing about it being based on WebSockets or based on HTTP and upgrading is that you have all those same headers. You have the cookies. So in your initial connection setup, you can, if you've already authenticated them on your site, you still have access to that authentication cookie and can process that and still have access to all that authentication data. So that you don't have to do anything complicated to pass authentication between the HTTP and the your normal web stuff and your WebSockets. Okay. So what does it look like? A WebSocket. This red stuff is the new things. Upgrade WebSocket, connection upgrade. And then you have some WebSocket stuff, very specific stuff. I don't know what most of that means, but that's what happens. Notice we're already on WebSocket version 13. They made a lot of changes to WebSockets over the years, so it's stabilized now. If you were an early adopter of WebSockets, it broke every couple months, but it's pretty stable now. So on the web server side, pretty much everything is different. So you're going to get a 101 switching protocols response. Again, upgrade WebSocket, connection upgrade, those are the same. And then some more WebSocket specific information that's used for establishing that WebSocket. So does that make sense? It's pretty straightforward, but your web server has to handle it. It has to know that when it gets this connection upgrade, it has to know what to do with it. So Nginx supports it. I honestly don't know if Apache supports it. It probably does. I do mine with Nginx, so I haven't had to deal with Apache for it. So in your in the JavaScript, it's very simple. That people always ask, well, is there a, have they implemented in jQuery, have they, that kind of thing? No, and you don't really need to, because it's dead simple. You say new WebSocket, you give it the address. You notice the WS instead of HTTP. That's just WebSocket. And then for that connection, similar to what was shown before, you have onMessage. So you're establishing callback functions for different events. So when a message comes in, we're going to do something with it. That's all you have to do. Yes?
So you're actually running your WebSocket off of Nginx?
Yeah, so in my case, it passes it through, it proxies the connection to my PHP script
So you have to have both.
that's running, yeah.
So it's really the PHP script is a daemon, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so it's really that daemon.
yeah, it's really,
that's supporting WebSocket, not.
yeah.
Nginx
But
itself.
what you can do with it, with Nginx, is you can have it still on port 80. And so you could have, certain paths get sent to your WebSockets rather than being processed normally.
So Nginx is your main web server.
So that way, yeah. So you're still running on port 80. You don't have to deal with any of the cross-domain, nonsense that everyone hates to deal with when you're doing JavaScript stuff. So yeah, so by running it through Nginx, it just makes it simpler for getting this up and running, because the client doesn't have to worry about all the other details. So we can send messages, con.send. So we have event handlers, and we have methods that do things, send and some close, other things like that. Okay, so in PHP, it's very simple. Now there's a little bit of magic here. You see I've got the demo chat object or a class that I'm instantiating there. But basically, all that class is a class that defines onMessage, onClose, onOpen, onError, things like that. I think it's just those four. So
Is that the class you wrote, or is that the class that they?
yes, and that's available. I'll show you my
Okay.
my GitHub. You can download it all. Here, I forgot I had this slide. So the demo chat class implements, there's a message component interface that's part of React PHP. So you have to define these four event handlers. So open, onClose, onError, onMessage. So you just have to know when something comes in, when a connection opens. Now in this case, you want to do something to hang on to that connection. You probably want to associate something with that connection, so you keep track of, so in my class, when that connection opens, it stores that connection information in an array that's a property of that class, so that it can access it later in order to, because if you want to, for example, when a message comes in, it tells you, which connection it came in on, but in the case of a chat server, you want to broadcast that message to all the other connections. So you've got to keep track of who all your connections are in order to broadcast. Does that make sense? If for some reason you didn't need to know everything else, then you wouldn't need to keep track of that. But I can't imagine a case where you wouldn't want to keep track of more information than just the connection resource. All right, let's do some demos. So I need to is that big enough? So I'm running my chat.php, which is a simple daemon that basically has that code I just showed. Now I go to my web server, and you notice it says web server active at localhost 8000. So I'm doing this simple web server that's included with Ratchet that you should really never use in production, but it's great for demos. And then I've got the chat server active at port 8080.
Question.
Yes?
Why are you firing two servers? Just out of convenience, or?
Out of convenience, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's one thing that I can run. I don't have to have a web server.
But you're sort of simulating the use on port 80 with a separate WebSocket call, right?
Yeah. Well, what's nice here is that by doing it this way, I'm showing you that you don't have to just do a WebSocket server. You can accept all sorts of, your event loop can handle more than one type of a request coming in. So we have one event loop handling web requests and WebSockets requests. So we are going to go here, and when I click the home, you'll see that the server registered that someone requested index.html, and it decided it was text/HTML and sent it back. Easy enough. So we're going to open a chat window, which will show up. Now, going back, you see it requested chat.html, and we had a WebSockets connection opened. Now here we have to give a name. So we'll call this guy demo, and we'll make him red. Okay, so then we'll open a new chat window. See how many we can fit. And we'll call this guy test. We'll make him green. So when I'm doing these, each time when I enter that information in, it's just in the JavaScript, it's creating a JSON thing, a packet that it sends over the WebSockets connection to my server that just has the information that I entered. And then on the server, it validates that information and decides it's okay, and I have a connection. And you can see.
For fun, maybe run this be dump in another window.
We could do that. So you can see the auth request that was received. And then I can open up another one. And I need another name. It's a good name. We'll call it 2. How about that? All right, so now when I write something, now they all had different colors. So you see how immediately, as soon as I hit enter, it shows up on all 3. So they all have separate connections, and the server as soon as it gets it, it broadcasts it out to the other ones. There's none of that, you're not polling every second, and so there's not even a little bit of lag. It just goes out immediately, but you're keeping that connection overhead to a minimum.
So each one of these chat clients is maintaining a persistent connection to the web server?
Yes, to the WebSocket server, yeah.
Right, as opposed to a normal web server which maintains it, which makes a request, gets it,
Yeah.
the connection drops.
Yeah, so it's the difference between having a two-way connection and relying on pull.
But you're using event handling to push the messages instead.
Right. So when that request comes in, it says, okay, it came in on this connection, let all the other connections know about it.
Question over here, how are we avoiding cross-domain problem? Because we're coming from port 80 or port 8000 and going to 8080. Is there something in the standard that says the WebSocket can be in different port, or
I don't
did you make?
I don't remember. I just know it works.
Okay. All right.
I don't remember what I did.
Doesn't care.
Yeah, I know it works. And
Each one's sending it from a different socket source, going to that. So, and it keeps
right.
going to a
Well, he's asking about the cross-domain issue. It's the same domain but different port, which can cause problems with some things.
Yeah, because I've had trouble
But-
with that, and I had to set up a.
I know in Flash there's all sorts of issues too you can have, but yeah.
Has something to do with the different protocols, one's using HTTP.
It might.
WebSockets. I don't know.
Yeah, I can go, let's see. Yeah, I don't have anything special in there. Uh-oh, I'm going to run out of. Is that too? I need to make this smaller. All right, so I don't think I'm doing anything fancy. No, it must just work on the different port. So
If you run it,
now you'll notice my chat server is no longer running. So these all connection closed up top. So they'll actually continue to, if I run it, they should all show up again eventually. Maybe not. Maybe they give up after a while. I had something where they would retry every so often if I just restarted the server, it'd be fine.
So
Yes?
on your chat room that you maintain for the unnamed sports team,
Yes.
do you use WebSockets?
Yes.
And how many persistent connections do you have?
I've had a couple hundred with no problem.
Because the little I've read about it, they've said that that's one of the downsides. Of the WebSockets is you're maintaining a connection instead of dropping it and freeing up resources.
It depends on what resources you're talking about.
File descriptor is
Yeah.
saying
It's
that
not.
you should be concerned about here pretty much.
Yeah.
Memory too, but.
Couldn't you do an entire chat service through just pure event-driven stuff without persistent connections?
Well, how do you know if
You need to have that push capability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where you need the persistent connections. So we're out of time. So I can talk to you out in the hall. We got to give time for the next presenter to set up. But the code's there. Steve Koog is my name on GitHub. If you were wondering what sports team we were talking about. And that's my. Please, if you get a chance, leave some feedback on Joined In. Let me know how I did and what I can do better. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.